Was a bright young teenager who fell hard for an older man.
He was charming and handsome.
She was crazy about him.
They look as they're in a perfect relationship.
But behind their smiling faces, trouble was brewing.
Nobody knew about this secret side of what she was doing.
He had been in trouble with the law.
She was going down a dangerous path.
And when she suddenly disappears, everyone fears the worst.
All the calls went unanswered.
Her family began to get alarmed.
They were taken aback.
Did she take off with her new boyfriend?
The family tell the detectives that she has become more rebellious.
He was living that type of lifestyle that would drive any parent crazy.
Or had her rebellious streak made her easy prey for a sadistic killer?
She would post these ads on the internet.
He had no regard for human life.
With a truth so shocking, no one saw it coming.
There was a second body and a second murder.
Somebody's gonna stand up and go, he's a serial killer. Do you want that on you?
She walked right into the lion's den without even realizing it.
I felt the devil. I honestly felt the devil.
2013. It's a frigid winter in St. Paul, one of Minnesota's twin cities.
The two main cities here are Minneapolis and St. Paul. They're basically sister cities.
Minneapolis is considered the big town, St. Paul, the smaller community.
We have 4 seasons, but the wintertime, it gets very cold.
It's not uncommon to have temperatures in the single digits or even below 0.
As the sun sets on St. Paul, those frigid temperatures have one young mother worried about her 18-year-old daughter, Brittany Clardy.
Brittany had gone out that morning to run some errands, but by nightfall, she still hadn't returned.
Brittany was living at home at the time with her family, her sister, her mom, her dad. They started to wonder, where's Brittany? What is she doing? And that's when the worries started.
She just isn't like her.
It's cold outside. It's getting dark. Immediately, your heart jumps and you think the worst case scenario, something bad happens.
Brittany's mother tries to reach her daughter by phone, but all of her calls go to voicemail.
She made calls. She received absolutely nothing. Not a word from Brittany.
Come on, baby. Pick up the phone.
She was frantically calling different people. Have you seen Brittany? Have you heard from Brittany?
Consumed with worry, Brittany's parents stay up late into the night, calling her phone over and over again, until they finally get an answer.
Brittany? Is that you?
Imagine calling, trying to reach her, and all of a sudden, the phone answers. Wow, I've got her on the phone. It's her.
Brittany?
But the excitement is short-lived.
Hello? Hello?
She could hear muffled sounds in the background, like something's going on.
There was just a ruffling in the background with nobody talking.
Then all of a sudden, the phone was disconnected.
What'd she say?
The line just went dead.
What do you mean the line went dead?
It just went dead.
Now the family is convinced that something is seriously wrong with Brittany.
Growing up in St. Paul, Brittany Clardy was raised by protective parents.
Brittany's parents made sure to keep her and her siblings away from the inner city violence that occurred, along with drugs.
This is a family that wanted the best for their children.
Shielded from many of the harsh realities her peers faced, Brittany was able to shine as a student.
Brittany was a very responsible young girl. Her parents and her family trusted her extensively. She had done well in school. She had done well at jobs.
She was very goal-oriented, looking into the future, already working, keeping herself busy.
She had a bright future ahead of her.
After graduating high school, Brittany's confidence in what she could accomplish only grew larger.
Brittany had plans to become a pharmacist.
She was applying to colleges and looking forward to starting a career.
It was around this time that Brittany started hanging out with a handsome young man from the neighborhood, Braxton Green.
She met Braxton in December of 2011, and then they ended up going on their first date on Christmas Eve.
Thanks for letting me steal you away from your family tonight.
They see me enough as it is.
Brittany and Braxton became serious very quickly. He was charming and handsome and swept her off her feet.
Every time he moved, every time he walked, every time he talked, it was Braxton, it's Braxton.
Before long, Braxton became Brittany's new priority.
Brittany floods her social media feeds with Braxton's picture, and they look as if they're in a perfect relationship.
All right, ready? Smile.
Brittany showed off, here's my boyfriend, here we are, had no qualms about it. It was her and Braxton.
Damn, we look good.
But there was one problem. Brittany's parents didn't approve of her new boyfriend.
Have you seen this?
Braxton was a 23-year-old man.
When they first met, Brittany was only 17 years old, and her parents didn't like the fact that she was hanging out with a grown man while she was underage.
Didn't matter to Brittany. She was in love with him. She was crazy about him. Her parents couldn't break that.
Now, Brittany is 18 years old, so she feels more free. I am not going to listen to you, Mom. I am an adult now.
This was the man of her dreams.
Head over heels is a good way to describe it.
But now, Brittany Clardy has vanished, and her parents are beginning to fear the worst after an alarming phone call.
When Brittany finally appeared to pick up the phone after several attempts to reach her, there was no voice, just some muffled noises, and then the phone disconnected.
Subsequent calls go straight to voicemail.
This made Brittany's family very, very concerned.
Brittany's parents decide to check in with her boyfriend, Braxton Green, to see if she's with him.
Hello?
Have you talked to Brittany?
You sound worried.
We are worried. We haven't spoken to her since this morning.
He told her, I have not seen her.
He said that he did have plans with Brittany for earlier that day, but Brittany never showed up.
Brittany's parents wait up all night, hoping she'll return their calls or show up on their doorstep.
I just don't understand.
They had given her the whole night to reach out, but Brittany had not reached out.
By morning, they decide to involve the authorities.
So I understand you're both here about your daughter.
When Brittany went missing, her family contacted the St. Paul Police Department.
She left home yesterday around 11:30.
That's right.
At first, police are reluctant to get involved.
They simply said that she was a runaway or that she would come back and not to worry.
The family, of course, is trying to convince them, hey, this is a very responsible young girl. We need to take this seriously.
And Brittany's parents also provide police with their first suspect.
The family did inform the police of Brittany's relationship with Braxton.
Their theory is Brittany's boyfriend may have something to do with this.
Brittany Clardy was in the prime of her life and head over heels for her new boyfriend, Braxton Green.
Braxton, this 23-year-old man, sweeps her off her feet. Braxton is charming, good-looking, and handsome.
Brittany was madly in love with Braxton.
But now, after leaving her parents' home on a chilly morning in the winter of 2013, Brittany has disappeared without a trace.
When she left home, it was 11:30, and by 1 to 1:30, the phone calls had absolutely stopped. There was nothing else.
That is, I would say, a mother's worst nightmare. When your child says, I'm going out to run some errands, and then an hour passes, another hour passes. Next thing you're talking evening.
When she didn't appear at home, mother then called her in as missing.
Brittany's family tells investigators they already have suspicions about what may have happened to her.
They told them they strongly suspected her boyfriend, Braxton.
The family suggested that he may have something to do with her disappearance.
I never liked him.
What don't you like about him?
They said Braxton was a bad influence and that he was leading Brittany in the wrong direction.
He had been in trouble with the law. He had a child by another relationship. Not the ideal person that they would want their daughter to date.
Brittany's parents are also concerned about the way Braxton treats their daughter.
Braxton demonstrated a controlling behavior. When Brittany did not respond to text messages or phone calls, he would become really angry.
He didn't have a full-time job. I mean, he was just always hanging out all the time. He would say, go buy me this, go get me that.
He's a bum, you know? And he's got her doing all this stuff she has no business doing.
Braxton liked to party, which Brittany also joined him in that lifestyle.
You know, Brittany generally lived a very clean lifestyle as a teenager growing up. And having Braxton in her life, he introduced her to partying. He introduced her to the alcohol. He got her into smoking weed.
Brittany's parents had worked so hard to keep her out of that life. But all of that went out the window when she got involved with Braxton.
She started to change. She became more abrasive. She became more confrontational. All of the stuff that goes with drugs and alcohol trickled into her life.
Brittany's parents say they wanted to let their daughter make her own decisions, but they eventually felt the need to intervene.
They had taken steps to try to convince her that maybe she should end the relationship.
Yet Brittany wasn't willing to listen.
Regardless of what Mom says, she was in love with Braxton.
I just know he had something to do with this. That's the only thing I can think of.
At the end of the interview, St. Paul police officially declare Brittany a missing person.
We'll be sure to keep you updated every step of the way.
They also put an ATL on that vehicle as well, attempt to locate. So if anyone were to run her car, if they were driving around, then that would come back as a hit.
While the investigators wait for leads to come in, they reach out to their sole person of interest, Braxton Green.
Hello?
Is this Braxton?
Yes, who's this?
I'm calling
From the St. Paul Police Department, in reference to
Brittany Clardy.
And we said, hey, we need your help. We're looking for her.
Do you have a moment to come down this evening and talk about this?
To detectives' surprise, Braxton refuses.
Listen, I really don't have much to tell you.
He was very evasive. I mean, he sent red flags just a flying. Yeah, I don't know where she is either. I've been looking for her. She won't answer her phone. The last I heard, she said she was gonna go take a nap somewhere.
Because he would not come in and talk to them, they put out an APB.
What we found and discovered is that he had an arrest warrant out for him already in a separate domestic-related case. It was either to do with child care or a probation violation or something, but he was being looked for to be placed under arrest.
With Braxton nowhere to be found, for days the investigation hits a standstill. But on February 21st, 10 days after Brittany disappeared, investigators catch a huge break in the case.
Thank you. The Clardy family received a letter that the car Brittany had been driving was at this impound lot in Columbia Heights.
The tow company also informs them that the car was found in an apartment complex in Brooklyn Park, which is 20 miles from where the family resides.
Investigators immediately head to the impound lot, eager to search the vehicle.
Detectives quickly discover there's a large number of items piled up on that footwell area in the back seat. So very meticulously, they begin to remove these items so they can document each one as they go.
Brittany had an iPhone. They didn't find the iPhone, but they did find 2 burner phones.
We also found what was called a vanilla Visa card, and more prominently, a bed sheet that had a very distinct pattern to it.
Underneath the sheet, they find something that stops them dead in their tracks.
We moved the belongings around in the back seat and said, oh my gosh.
There's a body in the back of the car.
Ten days after Brittany Clardy disappeared, detectives have tracked her vehicle to an impound lot in the St. Paul suburb of Columbia Heights.
This was the car that was reported as being connected to Brittany as being a missing person.
Inside, they make a disturbing discovery.
Very quickly, they can see there's somebody's body in the back seat.
The body is nearly frozen solid.
It gets so cold in Minnesota, and that in essence kind of freezes the crime scene or freezes it in time.
It had been below freezing for many days leading up to her discovery, which gives us the ability to preserve some of that physical evidence that's still there. Some of the wounds haven't degraded. The body hasn't begun to decompose at all because it's been frozen.
The body is carefully removed from the vehicle and transported to the medical examiner's office, where they confirm it belongs to Brittany Clardy.
Once her identity was confirmed, that was very difficult news for her family to grapple with. They were still hoping that she was out there alive somewhere.
The parents are just totally devastated. Our daughter's gone.
Their pain is only worsened by the discovery that Brittany suffered a violent death.
The medical examiner found some ligature around the neck, that she had possibly been choked or strangled. They also found many blows to the head.
Brittany had somewhere between 15 and 17 blows to the back of her head. It was likely from a hammer.
Now more than ever, detectives want to speak with Brittany's elusive boyfriend, Braxton Green.
They had to talk to Braxton. We gotta bring this guy in. We gotta talk to him.
As patrol officers continue scouring the city for Braxton, detectives work on submitting a records request for the burner phones found in Brittany's car.
After locating the burner phones, it did set off some red flags for the detectives. They are aware that people involved in illegal activity are prone to use burner cell phones.
The vanilla Visa found in the vehicle also gives detectives pause.
That vanilla Visa is one of those visas where you can use it and no one knows who you are. Why would you need such a product?
Before detectives can answer that question, they get the news they've been waiting for.
Lo and behold, we got notification the boyfriend was arrested. They finally found him.
They were able to finally take him into custody, and they took him to the police station for questioning.
Under questioning, Braxton tells detectives the same thing he told them on the phone, that he has no idea what happened to Brittany.
I already told you everything I know.
He told them I had nothing to do with her disappearance. I have nothing to do with it.
He was denying it.
He tried to make it clear to the police that he did love Brittany. He said he really cared about her and that he would not do anything to hurt her.
When was the last time you saw her?
It was the night before she went missing. Then the next day she called me while she was out running around.
Brittany told him that she was tired and was gonna go to bed and take a nap and would see him later in the day.
We made plans to hang out that night, but a few hours went by and I didn't hear anything. I called her, but she wasn't answering.
He denies knowing about where she would have been that day. He denied having anything to do with her disappearance.
When it becomes clear that Braxton isn't going to offer up a confession, detectives try a different tactic.
They kept asking him, okay, if you didn't do anything to her, do you have anything that you know of that was going on in Brittany's life that would have led to her possibly being murdered?
We found burner phones and a disposable Visa in Brittany's car. Now, what can you tell me about that?
Police kept pressuring and pushing. That's when he told them something that they never thought of.
We did not expect this in any way, shape, or form.
Braxton told them that Brittany had engaged in online prostitution.
After 10 days of searching for missing Minnesota teenager Brittany Clardy, detectives made a disturbing discovery: the young woman's dead body in the back seat of her abandoned vehicle.
She had been strangled. She was struck in the head with a blunt object.
She was brutally murdered.
Now, less than 24 hours later, police have tracked down their prime suspect, Brittany's 23-year-old boyfriend, Braxton Green.
Braxton had refused to come in and speak with detectives. Now they had him in custody, and he was denying any involvement in this crime.
However, Braxton has admitted something else to the detectives, something they never could have imagined.
He said Brittany had been posting ads on sexual service websites and was engaging in sexual relations with clients for money.
Police find the claim hard to believe.
That came as a big surprise to the investigators.
It just didn't fit her profile. Didn't fit anything about her.
But Braxton insists he's telling the truth.
Were you pimping her out?
Hell no. I didn't even like that she was doing it. But she wanted the money.
Working in a recreation center, the pay wasn't just enough, and she wanted to buy things. She needed some extra cash, so she started thinking, how can I do it?
I don't feel like the prostitution is indicative of like who she was or her character. I think it was more, this was her first stab at independence and making her own decisions for herself.
She went on this one website a lot called Backpage or something like that.
The detectives are familiar with Backpage. At the time, it had become a notorious site for prostitution and sex trafficking.
People would go on there and say that these are the things they're willing to do for this amount of money.
Braxton said Brittany would make calls with those possible clients through her burner phones, and that's how she would engage in customers.
At first, Brittany wasn't offering sex.
It started off where she would just do massages, but then she wanted the money you got for doing other stuff.
Although he didn't approve of what she was doing, Braxton says he would sometimes accompany Brittany when she met up with a client.
He admitted to police that at times he would go out on some of those calls with Brittany, and he would sit outside and wait for her in the car or whatever. It's a safety measure, make sure nothing bad happened.
Some of these guys were sketchy. I didn't want her getting hurt.
Do you know if she met with any of these clients around the time she went missing?
I don't know, but she was talking about needing money, so I wouldn't be surprised.
By the end of the interview, detectives are starting to believe that Braxton is telling the truth.
He was very cooperative. He handed over his phone, all his information.
Braxton's phone, it was pinging off of towers that were not anywhere near the location of where Brittany's body was found.
He's in a different part of the Twin Cities metro area, not even close. Long story short is that we came out of the interview satisfied, thinking that he was not involved in her disappearance or in her death.
Now, the detectives have a new theory about what happened to Brittany.
They were beginning to think her murder might have been related to her activities as an escort.
our eyebrows raised and thought, well, maybe there's something here.
Detectives decide to canvass the apartment complex in Brooklyn Park where Brittany's car had been impounded.
The police had great reason to believe that Brittany was last alive, perhaps in Brooklyn Park.
So the investigation was extremely extensive. I mean, we were canvassing the area, pulling cameras in the area.
They knocked on doors all over that location, but no one remembered seeing Brittany or even knew who she was.
However, detectives make more progress when they get their hands on the data from Brittany's burner phones.
These records, they're voluminous. There's many dozens, if not hundreds of pages. What they find is in the last few hours of the afternoon of February 11th, Brittany's got some contacts with an Atlanta area code number.
It was a phone that was actually purchased and registered in the name of Alberto Palmer.
It gave them the key to this entire investigation.
For nearly 3 weeks, Minnesota detectives have been working to untangle the final hours of Brittany Clardy's life.
Investigators sought the records of Brittany's phone, the text messages, who's been calling her, who she's been calling.
Even though she was deceased, in a way, she was kind of helping us solve this case through her phone records.
Now, detectives think they found the key to solving Brittany's murder buried in the call log of one of her burner phones.
Police discovered that Brittany had been in contact with a 25-year-old man named Alberto Palmer on the day that she disappeared.
There were several phone calls and messages that took place in the early afternoon hours of February 11th, even going back a couple days before that, about potentially Brittany providing some massage services to Mr. Palmer.
We did some work on the name Alberto Palmer. We found out that Mr. Palmer had a warrant out for his arrest out of a city called Chamblee, Georgia, and that's just outside Atlanta.
The reason for the warrant immediately sets off alarm bells.
He's wanted there for violent attacks against sex workers.
There were 3 different assault cases out of Chamblee, Georgia, involving Alberto, all 3 of which were females that were involved in prostitution and had gone over to his residence. And in all 3 cases, he had physically assaulted these females.
Had he done the same to Brittany Clardy? When investigators subpoena Alberto's phone records, they learn that he's recently been in communication with a family member who lives near where Brittany's car was found.
It was a few blocks from where the car was located, so now we have an address in Brooklyn Park.
He had actually ordered pizza to that address, I believe on the 11th, around where Brittany Clardy was murdered.
So now we're very curious.
However, more recent cell phone pings suggest that Alberto may have left Brooklyn Park in the days since Brittany's disappearance.
Alberto's phone number is going to a house in Woodbury, Minnesota. Brooklyn Park is on the west side. They're like 25, 30 miles apart.
So it's complicated the case a little bit because we had 2 separate locations. We had to plan basically simultaneous warrants at both locations.
On March 6th, the investigators launched their coordinated strike.
We were able to pretty much hit the Brooklyn Park location and the Woodbury location pretty close to the same time.
They do what's called the knock and talk. We're just gonna knock on the door, see who answers, and see if they know anything.
In Brooklyn Park, Alberto Palmer's family member comes to the door.
Hi, can I help you?
Yes, ma'am. We're with the St. Paul Police Department.
As the police talk to her, they find out, Alberto was in fact at that place on February 11th, the day that Brittany disappeared.
Alberto's family member agrees to show police the room where he had stayed.
Sure, come on in.
Thank you.
There appeared to be a cleanup inside as there were large bleach spots in one of the bedrooms.
She says, oh yeah. Then there was that day that I came home and he said he had spilled Kool-Aid and he made me help him clean it up.
So literally just pouring bleach on spots in the carpet.
Investigators don't think the stains were made by Kool-Aid.
They fairly easily pull up the carpet to reveal the blood that had soaked through into the subfloor. And at this point, they know this is likely the crime scene. This is likely where Brittany Clardy was killed.
Investigators' suspicions are all but confirmed when they show Alberto's family member a photo of the bedsheet they found covering Brittany's body.
It was a very distinctive pattern on the sheet.
It was a picture of a bed sheet that was hers that she knew was in their apartment.
Oh my God, yeah, that's my bed sheet, that's it.
The sheet that was used to cover Brittany Clardy in the car, we've now been able to trace back to coming from that residence.
Meanwhile, police officers across town are able to take Alberto Palmer into custody at the home in Woodbury, Minnesota, where his cell phone last pinged.
We were able to arrest the suspect without incident.
He had his backpack with him right where he was arrested. In his backpack was Brittany's iPhone.
Investigators immediately transport Alberto back to the station for questioning.
He's brought to the Anoka County Sheriff's Department where he gives an interview.
Alberto begins the interview by revealing some forthcoming information about his past.
I was diagnosed bipolar.
Okay.
I was going through therapy for over 10 years for anger problems, as well as I've been in a mental institution 3 times.
Alberto tells police he didn't do anything to Brittany Clardy, at least not that he can remember.
I tend to black out. It's hard for me to just remember things.
Is it black out and then do things that you would never dream of doing in real life?
Exactly.
For several hours, he denies knowing anything to do with Brittany's murder or even knowing Brittany.
But as the interrogation heats up, Alberto starts to tell a different story.
We would give him details, then it was like jogging his memory of what had taken place.
I need you to really dig deep into your noggin, and I want you to come out with the rest of it, because you know what happened.
I mean, Detective, I'm telling you what I remember.
Eventually, he acknowledges that he had solicited Brittany for sexual services. He acknowledged they had some degree of sex.
And finally, after hours of unrelenting interrogation, Alberto makes a shocking confession.
When I realized, what you just did, I honestly felt the devil inside of me.
Nearly a month after 18-year-old Brittany Clardy vanished, Minnesota police have arrested Alberto Palmer for killing her and hiding her body.
During the interview, he was giving some information but not coming clean with all the details of what had occurred.
Okay. All of this, I'm stressed out, and just a lot of times I tend to forget things. I tend to black out.
He had remembered only bits and pieces.
But when Detective LaFamme confronts Alberto with the blood evidence they found in his family member's Brooklyn Park apartment, he starts to open up.
It's very, very clear from what happened up in Brooklyn Park that there was a lot of effort put into cleaning the room up, okay? There was a lot of effort to put this young lady in the car and to cover her up.
According to Alberto, he was experiencing one of his blackouts until it was too late.
First thing I saw was when I was putting on a car seat.
Okay.
Honestly, the only thing I remember is going in the car.
Alberto tells Detective LaFamme it was like he was possessed by an evil spirit.
When I realized, what you just did, I felt the devil. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like I'm satanic or nothing, but just I felt the devil.
Yeah. What else was the devil doing?
Alberto claims he doesn't remember anything else that happened that night. But when investigators resume questioning the next morning, they have a breakthrough.
In our second day of interviewing, Sergeant Russ had a go at him. I had been the nice detective, and Russ went in and took a little bit of a different approach, which was really effective.
I've dealt with a lot of cases similar to yours as far as, possessions and people getting possessed by a devil and poltergeist like that, right? I get it, dude. You can get possessed, it happens to you, and you're like, what the f am I doing? I get it, and I've dealt with it, and that's kind of why I deal with a lot of people when I came in and try and give you one last shot here. Right? Mike's a decent guy, but he's not real good with the being possessed. You know what I'm saying? So what happened?
You got a pen?
You want to write it? I'm sure you get. All right, man. All right. Tell me it's recorded.
Alberto admits that on February 11th, while his family member was at work, he invited Brittany over to have sex.
He says that at some point they began to tussle, I believe were his words.
As we was having sex, it's like we started to fight. And as we fighting, it's like we tussling in the room on bed.
What are you doing? Get off me!
He describes that he choked her.
I choked her to the point where she was just laying there.
He choked her to the point of unconsciousness, believing she was dead. And while he was gathering himself, realized that she was still alive.
Alberto says he knew he couldn't let Brittany leave after what happened between them.
So I ran in the kitchen and was looking in the drawer.
He went through the kitchen drawers, found a hammer, brought a hammer up to the room.
As I ran back in the room, she was trying to get past me. We was still tussling again. So I hit her. I just kept hitting her. And it's like I couldn't stop.
He couldn't give an exact amount of times, but brutally hit her on the head numerous times until she wasn't moving anymore.
Once Brittany was dead, Alberto says he came up with a plan to get rid of her body.
The only thing I think is like, nah, I have to get this away from you. And that's when I put her in the car.
He admitted to taking the car up to the apartment lot and walking back, disposing of the keys on the way.
Immediately following Alberto's stunning confession, police charge him with first-degree murder.
You made a mistake. You're going to stand up and be accountable and responsible for that.
Based off of his previous altercations in Georgia and then him coming to Minnesota and doing the same thing, it seemed like he definitely was developing into somewhat of a psychopathic killer.
It was a relief to have him off the streets, so he couldn't hurt any more young women.
But before Alberto stands trial, investigators on the opposite side of the Mississippi River make a grisly discovery.
In May of 2013, a body had been found in the trunk of a car that was in an impound lot in Minneapolis.
When word of the events reaches detectives in St. Paul, they're struck by the similarities to Brittany's murder.
It was eerily similar to the Clarity case, so right away Alberto was kind of a person of interest.
The new victim is identified as 24-year-old Clarissa Cook, a young woman who lived in Brooklyn Park.
She had also been advertising escort services on Backpage.com. And upon doing some search warrants on her phone number, we were able to find out that Alberto was the last person that Clarissa's phone had any communication with.
Crime scene evidence eventually reveals that Clarissa was killed in the same apartment where Brittany Clardy's life was taken.
Blood samples did come back to Clarissa.
Armed with this new evidence, prosecutors believe they have what they need to convict Alberto of both murders. But to avoid a painful trial for the victims' families, they decide to offer him a plea deal.
One of the things we talked with the Clardy family about is anytime you go to trial, if somebody's convicted, that's not the end of it. A conviction will automatically go to Supreme Court on appeal. The family didn't want to go through that emotional roller coaster.
In exchange for pleading guilty to the murders of Brittany Clardy and Clarissa Cook, Alberto manages to avoid a life sentence.
What this means is Mr. Palmer serves 30 years before the possibility of parole. The minute he's paroled, if he ever is, he begins his 40-year sentence for the murder of Brittany Clardy. So likely Mr. Palmer will never be released from custody.
January 31st, 1969. Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Winter had swallowed the city whole. The streets were wrapped beneath layers of packed snow that had hardened over weeks of relentless cold, while the morning sky hung low, painted in pale shades of gray that promised another day without sunlight. Frost clung to every telephone wire, every fence post, every bare tree branch standing silently against the frozen horizon. At first glance, it looked like any other prairie winter morning. Cars struggled to start. Chimneys released thin streams of smoke into the bitter air. Neighbors hurried from their front doors with their collars turned high, heads lowered against the wind, each person focused only on getting through another ordinary day. There was nothing about that morning that warned anyone history was about to change. Nothing suggested that within a few hours a young woman would lose her life, an innocent teenager would lose more than 2 decades of freedom, and an entire justice system would one day be forced to confront one of its darkest failures. Sometimes history does not arrive with sirens or gunfire. Sometimes it begins with the quiet click of a front door closing behind someone who expects to be home before dinner. 20-year-old Gail Miller stepped outside into the cold with the same routine she had followed countless mornings before. She was on her way to work, carrying the quiet determination of someone who had already begun building a life devoted to caring for others. The snow beneath her boots gave a familiar crunch with every step. Her breath disappeared into the freezing air in soft white clouds that vanished almost as quickly as they formed. Somewhere in the distance, a bus engine groaned awake. A dog barked behind a wooden fence before falling silent again. The neighborhood continued moving with the comforting rhythm of ordinary life, completely unaware that these simple sounds would soon be replaced by questions, grief, and decades of unanswered doubt. If someone had watched Gail from a nearby window, they would have seen nothing remarkable. Just another young woman walking toward a bus stop on another cold Canadian morning. They could not have known they were witnessing the last ordinary moments of her life. There would be no dramatic warning, no suspicious stranger lurking in plain sight, no cinematic clue that could have changed what was coming. Evil often hides behind the appearance of normality. It waits patiently inside the routine moments people trust the most. Hours later, police officers would stand over a body partially hidden beneath snow in a nearby alley. Detectives would kneel in silence as the realization settled over the crime scene. A city that had awakened peacefully would now spend years haunted by a single question. Who killed Gail Miller? The answer seemed obvious at first. Then it became complicated. Then it became tragically wrong. Before the truth finally emerged, another life would be destroyed. A 16-year-old boy named David Milgaard would become the face of one of Canada's most infamous murder convictions. He would be called a monster by strangers, condemned by a courtroom, and locked behind prison walls while insisting, year after year, that he had never killed anyone. His words echoed into silence. Appeals failed. Doors closed. Hope slowly faded. Outside prison walls, memories grew old. Witnesses forgot details. Evidence gathered dust. The world moved forward while time stood still for one man. For 23 years, the case appeared finished. Until science began asking questions that the investigation never had. The DNA hidden inside forgotten evidence told a story completely different from the one presented to a jury decades earlier. It pointed not toward the teenager whose future had been erased, but toward a violent predator who had been living frighteningly close to where Gail had taken her final steps that winter morning. Suddenly, everything prosecutors had once described as certainty collapsed beneath the weight of undeniable forensic truth. A murder that had supposedly been solved had never actually been solved at all. This is not only the story of a homicide. It is the story of 2 victims. One lost her life before reaching work on a freezing January morning. The other lost 23 years of his life inside prison for a crime he did not commit. And somewhere between those 2 tragedies lies a haunting question that still echoes through courtrooms, police academies, and criminal justice classrooms today. How can an investigation become so convinced it has found the right suspect that it stops searching for the real killer? To understand that question, we have to travel back to a Canada very different from the one we know today. This was an era before surveillance cameras watched every intersection. Before mobile phones could record locations down to the second. Before DNA transformed criminal investigations forever. Detectives relied heavily on eyewitnesses, handwritten reports, instinct, and confessions. Scientific tools that modern investigators now consider routine simply did not exist. Once investigators settled on a theory, every new piece of information risked being interpreted through that single lens. It was a system built by human beings, and like every system built by human beings, it was vulnerable to human error. But even understanding those limitations does not erase what happened. Because this case was not merely about missing technology. It was about assumptions. It was about pressure. It was about memories shaped by fear. And it was about the devastating consequences that unfold when certainty arrives long before the truth. Imagine the city as it stood that winter. Snowbanks rose shoulder-high along residential streets. Children bundled in thick coats dragged sleds across frozen schoolyards. Hospital workers hurried through icy parking lots before beginning long shifts caring for patients. Shopkeepers brushed fresh snow away from storefront entrances. Families planned weekend dinners, birthday celebrations, church services, ordinary moments that seemed immune from violence. Saskatoon was not a city expecting to become the center of one of Canada's greatest miscarriages of justice. Like countless communities across North America in the late 1960s, people believed terrible crimes happened somewhere else. Not here. Not to someone simply walking to work. That illusion would not survive the day. News spread quietly at first. A body had been found. A young woman. Near her own neighborhood. Then came the details people whispered instead of saying aloud. She had been attacked. She had been stabbed repeatedly. The brutality shocked even experienced investigators. Parents called children home earlier than usual. Doors were locked before sunset. Women who had always walked alone to bus stops suddenly asked family members for rides. Fear settled over the city not because violence was common, but because it seemed random. If someone like Gail Miller could disappear between her home and a bus stop, then no familiar street felt entirely safe anymore. Police knew public pressure would arrive quickly. Every passing day without an arrest would deepen the community's anxiety. Every newspaper headline would ask whether a killer remained free. Every rumor would create another possible suspect. Detectives faced an investigation where speed mattered almost as much as accuracy. The public demanded reassurance. The victim's family deserved answers. The city wanted certainty. And certainty, when investigators desperately need it, can become dangerously seductive. Not far from Saskatoon that same morning, a teenage traveler and several friends were making what should have been an ordinary journey across Western Canada. They were young, restless, and focused on reaching Vancouver. None of them imagined that a wrong turn through unfamiliar streets would eventually alter the course of multiple lives forever. They could not have known that simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time would place one of them beneath a shadow that would stretch across decades. History often looks inevitable after the fact. It never feels that way while it is happening. At the time, every decision seemed small. A route taken. A conversation remembered differently. A statement repeated one more time. A detective deciding which witness sounded most believable. A prosecutor building a story from pieces that appeared to fit. A jury trying to make sense of conflicting accounts. Each step seemed reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a path leading toward one of the most devastating judicial errors Canada would ever witness. Long before DNA laboratories would reopen forgotten evidence, before headlines would speak of exoneration, before government officials would issue apologies, there was only a frozen city searching desperately for someone to blame. And hidden somewhere beneath the snow, beneath assumptions, beneath incomplete memories and flawed conclusions, the real killer continued walking free, unnoticed, while another young life was slowly being prepared for sacrifice in the name of justice. That is where our story truly begins. Before a crime becomes a headline, before detectives arrive with notebooks and cameras, before courtrooms, verdicts, and decades of unanswered questions, there is always a life. A routine. A collection of ordinary moments that seem too small to matter until they suddenly become the last memories anyone has left. That was who Gail Miller was. She was not a mystery waiting to be solved or a name destined to appear in legal textbooks. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a young woman standing at the beginning of a future she had every reason to believe would continue unfolding one quiet day after another. In the late 1960s, Saskatoon was growing steadily. It was a prairie city where neighborhoods still carried a sense of familiarity, where people recognized one another in grocery stores and waved to neighbors while shoveling snow from sidewalks. Winters were harsh, but they were also accepted as part of daily life. The cold shaped routines, conversations, even personalities. Children learned early how to dress in heavy layers before stepping outside. Adults measured distance not only in blocks but also in minutes spent exposed to the freezing wind. Snow was not an event. It was simply another part of living. Gail had grown up surrounded by that environment. Those who knew her described someone dependable, quiet without being shy, and naturally compassionate. She was not the loudest person in a room, nor someone seeking attention. Instead, she possessed the kind of calm presence that often went unnoticed until people realized how much they relied on it. Friends remembered someone who listened more than she spoke. Family members saw a young woman who rarely complained, even when life demanded more from her than seemed fair. Her decision to become a nurse's aide reflected that personality perfectly. Caring for patients required patience, empathy, and emotional strength. The work was physically exhausting and emotionally demanding, particularly in an era when hospital staff worked long hours with fewer resources than modern medicine provides today. Yet Gail embraced that responsibility. Every shift meant helping strangers through pain, illness, recovery, or loss. She chose a profession centered on kindness long before anyone would remember her because of tragedy. Those close to her often noticed the small habits that made Gail uniquely herself. She liked routine. She prepared for work carefully, making sure everything was in its proper place before leaving home. She valued punctuality, believing that arriving on time showed respect for the people depending on her. She was thoughtful with money, practical in her decisions, and optimistic enough to imagine a future beyond the long Canadian winters. Like countless young adults her age, she carried ordinary dreams rather than extraordinary ambitions. She hoped for stability, meaningful work, perhaps marriage someday, perhaps children. Nothing about those hopes suggested they would remain forever unfinished. January 1969 arrived with the relentless cold typical of Saskatchewan winters. Daylight came late and disappeared early. Streets remained lined with towering banks of snow pushed aside by city plows. Cars often refused to start without assistance, forcing neighbors to help one another on freezing mornings. The wind swept across open spaces with an intensity that could numb exposed skin within minutes. Yet people adapted because they had no choice. Life continued despite the weather. Schools opened. Businesses operated. Hospitals remained full. Every morning thousands of residents stepped into the cold knowing exactly what awaited them. For Gail, Friday, January 31st, began no differently. She woke before sunrise, preparing for another workday. The house was warm compared to the frozen darkness outside. Breakfast was simple. Conversation with family members was ordinary. No one exchanged emotional goodbyes because there was no reason to. It was simply another morning. The kind that disappears into memory because it seems identical to hundreds before it. Somewhere inside the house, a clock quietly measured each passing minute. Outside, snow reflected the pale morning light. Nothing seemed unusual. No one sensed danger waiting only a short distance away. When Gail finally put on her winter coat, gloves, and boots, she was following a familiar routine repeated countless times before. She stepped through the front door and entered the cold air carrying only what she needed for another shift at work. Her destination was nearby. She intended to walk to a bus stop before continuing toward the hospital. It was a route she knew well. A route she trusted. A route many people walked every day. There is something especially haunting about crimes that interrupt ordinary routines. People prepare themselves for danger in unfamiliar places. They expect risk while traveling through isolated areas or walking alone late at night. But daylight creates a false sense of security. Residential streets feel predictable. Familiar neighborhoods feel safe because they are familiar. The human mind naturally believes that repetition guarantees protection. Reality often proves otherwise. As Gail walked through her neighborhood, life unfolded around her exactly as it always had. Curtains opened inside nearby homes. Kitchen lights illuminated windows where families prepared breakfast. A delivery truck moved cautiously along icy streets. Smoke drifted from chimneys into the frozen sky. Somewhere, a radio played the morning news while someone else scraped frost from a windshield before leaving for work. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested violence. Nothing suggested someone was watching. Nothing warned that every step Gail took brought her closer to becoming the victim of an attack so brutal it would shock an entire nation. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away from where future headlines would eventually lead, another story was beginning to unfold without anyone recognizing its importance. A group of young travelers was making its way across Western Canada. They were teenagers with little money and big plans, focused on reaching Vancouver. Like countless young people chasing adventure during the late 1960s, they viewed the journey itself as part of the experience. Roads connected cities, opportunities, and dreams. They had no idea that a brief stop in Saskatoon would permanently alter one of their lives. Their paths and Gail's path were moving toward the same city. Only one of those journeys would end before noon. Back in Saskatoon, the city continued operating beneath a blanket of silence created by snow. Winter has a peculiar way of muting sound. Footsteps become softer. Traffic moves more cautiously. Even conversations seem quieter beneath scarves wrapped tightly around faces. It creates the illusion of peace, a stillness that can make danger seem impossible. Investigators would later reconstruct Gail's final known movements minute by minute, attempting to understand exactly where routine ended and violence began. Every estimated time became significant. Every street corner mattered. Every possible witness suddenly possessed information that seemed ordinary at the time but invaluable afterward. Yet memory is fragile. People remember fragments rather than complete stories. A passing face. A parked vehicle. Someone walking quickly through the cold. Small details fade almost immediately because the brain has no reason to preserve what appears unimportant. Only later do those forgotten moments become priceless. The neighborhood where Gail lived represented the quiet confidence of everyday Canadian life. Parents believed their children could walk to school. Workers trusted public transportation. Residents expected that if something unusual happened, someone would notice. Communities depended on familiarity as a form of protection. But familiarity can also create blindness. A stranger attracts attention. Someone who appears to belong often does not. That subtle truth would become one of the invisible threads running throughout this entire case. At the hospital where Gail worked, colleagues expected another normal day. Patients required care. Nurses organized schedules. Doctors prepared for rounds. No one realized one member of their team would never arrive. At first, lateness might have seemed unusual but not alarming. Buses ran behind schedule during winter. Cars became stuck in snow. Delays happened. Minutes slowly became an hour. Then another. Concern quietly replaced assumption. Far away from the hospital corridors, events were already unfolding that would soon draw police officers into an investigation unlike anything Saskatoon had experienced before. Years later, when journalists, lawyers, and forensic experts looked back on the case, many focused on DNA evidence, courtroom testimony, and wrongful conviction. Those chapters deserve attention because they transformed Canadian legal history. But beneath all of that remained the simplest and saddest truth. None of those later events would have existed if one young woman had reached her bus stop safely that morning. The tragedy did not begin inside a courtroom. It began with an ordinary walk to work. A walk measured in only a few blocks. A walk taken in daylight. A walk through streets she had every reason to trust. And somewhere, hidden behind the quiet rhythm of a winter morning, someone else was making decisions that would shatter countless lives long before anyone even realized a crime had been committed. Before investigators assigned case numbers, before newspapers printed headlines across their front pages, before lawyers argued over testimony and evidence, Gail Miller existed only as herself. She was not a symbol. She was not a victim. She was simply a young woman whose life was moving forward with the quiet confidence that accompanies ordinary dreams. Those who loved her never imagined they would one day be asked to remember her through photographs instead of conversations, through courtroom testimony instead of family gatherings. Every tragedy begins by stealing a future that once seemed completely certain. At 20 years old, Gail had already developed the kind of maturity that often comes from responsibility rather than age. Working as a nurse's aide demanded discipline, compassion, and emotional resilience. Hospitals in the late 1960s were busy, demanding places where long hours were expected, and every member of the staff carried responsibilities that directly affected the lives of patients. The work itself was not glamorous. It required lifting patients, cleaning rooms, comforting frightened families, and performing countless small tasks that rarely attracted recognition. Yet these were the moments that defined Gail's character. She found meaning not in being noticed, but in being useful. Her co-workers would later remember her as dependable. If she promised to help, she helped. If a shift became unexpectedly difficult, she stayed focused instead of complaining. There was a calm steadiness about her that made people comfortable in her presence. Patients often trusted caregivers who listened more than they spoke, and Gail possessed that rare ability to make people feel seen without drawing attention to herself. She approached others with quiet kindness, not because it was expected, but because it came naturally. At home, she remained deeply connected to her family. Their house was filled with the ordinary rhythms shared by countless Canadian families of the era. Meals were eaten together whenever schedules allowed. Conversations centered on work, neighbors, upcoming weekends, and plans for the future. There were disagreements, certainly, but they were the kind that faded quickly because affection outweighed frustration. Gail had become an important part of that routine. Her presence was woven into everyday life so naturally that no one imagined what the house would feel like without her. The late 1960s were a period of enormous change across North America. Music, politics, fashion, and culture seemed to evolve almost overnight. Young people dreamed about travel, education, and opportunities their parents had never experienced. Yet Gail's ambitions remained grounded. She was not chasing celebrity or excitement. She valued stability more than adventure. She believed in hard work and gradual progress. The future she imagined was built from simple milestones rather than dramatic transformations. A steady career. Financial independence. Perhaps one day a family of her own. Those dreams were shared by millions of young adults. That was precisely what made her story so devastating. She could have been anyone. She represented the countless ordinary people whose names never appear in history books because they simply live their lives with honesty and quiet determination. Friends remembered her smile more than her words. It was never exaggerated or forced. It appeared naturally during conversations, softening even difficult days. She had a gentle sense of humor that surfaced unexpectedly, often through small observations rather than loud jokes. She laughed easily, but she never laughed at someone else's expense. There was warmth in the way she interacted with people, a warmth impossible to capture fully in photographs or official records. The photographs that survived show a young woman with hopeful eyes, standing confidently at the beginning of adulthood. Looking at those images today, knowing everything that followed, creates a feeling that is difficult to describe. The camera preserved a moment untouched by fear. She did not know history was waiting only days, perhaps hours, ahead. She smiled because life still belonged to her. Like many healthcare workers, Gail understood suffering. She had witnessed illness and recovery, fear and relief, life and death. Working inside a hospital exposed people to human vulnerability every single day. Yet even that experience could not prepare someone for the randomness of violence outside those walls. Hospitals taught that tragedy often arrived through disease or accident. They did not teach that danger could be hiding along the familiar route between home and work. January 31st began with the same quiet determination Gail brought to every working day. She dressed warmly against the Saskatchewan winter, knowing the short walk to the bus stop would expose her to freezing temperatures. Thick boots protected her feet from packed snow. Gloves shielded her hands from the bitter wind. Her winter coat wrapped tightly around her as she prepared to leave home. There was nothing unusual about her appearance because nothing unusual was expected. Inside the house, family members continued with their own morning routines. There were likely reminders exchanged before anyone left. Drive safely. Stay warm. See you later. These ordinary phrases, repeated thousands of times in households around the world, become heartbreaking when unknowingly spoken for the final time. Nobody pauses to appreciate them because nobody imagines they are saying goodbye forever. When Gail stepped outside, the cold immediately surrounded her. The air carried that sharp prairie bite capable of making every breath feel crisp inside the lungs. Snow reflected the pale morning light, bright enough to illuminate the streets despite the overcast sky. Her footsteps pressed fresh impressions into the packed snow as she began walking toward the bus stop. She had taken this route before. Dozens of times. Perhaps hundreds. Routine has a way of convincing us that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. Every successful journey reinforces the belief that the next one will also end safely. Human beings depend on that assumption because without it, ordinary life would become impossible. We cross streets believing traffic will stop at red lights. We board buses believing drivers will arrive safely. We leave our homes believing we will return. Gail had every reason to trust her routine. As she walked through the neighborhood, familiar houses lined the streets on either side. Curtains moved as residents prepared for work or school. Cars sat partially buried beneath fresh snow while owners brushed ice from their windshields. Somewhere nearby, children bundled themselves into oversized winter coats before beginning another school day. It was the kind of peaceful suburban scene that rarely attracts attention because it appears so completely ordinary. Yet hidden within ordinary mornings are moments that later become impossible to forget. Investigators would eventually spend years trying to reconstruct Gail's final walk. They studied distances between intersections. They estimated walking speeds. They interviewed anyone who might have seen her. Every minute mattered because every minute narrowed the window during which the attack occurred. But at that moment, Gail herself was thinking about something entirely different. Perhaps she was mentally preparing for work. Perhaps she was considering plans for the weekend. Perhaps she was simply hoping the bus would arrive on time so she could escape the cold. Whatever occupied her thoughts, fear almost certainly was not among them. Predators often rely on predictability. They exploit routines because routines make people easier to anticipate. A familiar schedule becomes a map. The same departure time. The same destination. The same path. None of these habits are dangerous by themselves. They only become dangerous when observed by someone searching for opportunity instead of coincidence. Years later, the man ultimately identified through DNA evidence, Larry Fisher, would emerge as someone capable of exactly that kind of calculated violence. But on that January morning, neither Gail nor anyone else knew such a predator was nearby. To the neighborhood, he was simply another face among many. Invisible not because he literally disappeared, but because nothing outwardly separated him from everyone else sharing the city that morning. That reality remains one of the most unsettling aspects of crimes committed by strangers. There is often no warning. No previous argument. No visible connection between victim and offender. Two lives moving through the same city suddenly collide, and one of them ends forever. As Gail continued toward the bus stop, the distance remaining grew shorter with every step. She was close enough to believe she would soon board the bus and continue another normal workday. Somewhere ahead waited public transportation, co-workers, patients, conversations, and responsibilities she expected to fulfill. She never reached them. The attack that followed would be swift, brutal, and deeply personal despite being committed by someone she almost certainly did not know. The violence inflicted upon her reflected an overwhelming determination to dominate and destroy. More than 20 stab wounds would later tell investigators that this was not a robbery gone wrong or a spontaneous confrontation. It was an explosion of uncontrolled brutality that left a young woman with no chance of survival. Out of respect for Gail and for the reality of what happened, the details of her final moments are less important than the life they interrupted. True crime often risks allowing violence to overshadow humanity. Yet the greatest injustice is not simply how someone dies. It is allowing their death to become more memorable than the life they lived. For Gail Miller, that life deserved to be remembered for compassion instead of tragedy, for quiet strength instead of headlines, for mornings spent preparing to care for patients rather than the horror that prevented her from ever reaching them. The city would soon learn her name through newspaper reports. Investigators would study her final movements. Lawyers would invoke her memory inside crowded courtrooms. Journalists would revisit her case for decades. But before she became any of those things, she was simply a young woman walking to work through the frozen streets of Saskatoon, believing she had an entire lifetime still waiting ahead. She never had the chance to discover just how much of that future would be stolen in a matter of minutes, nor could she have known that her death would forever reshape the lives of everyone connected to one of Canada's most tragic miscarriages of justice. The attack began in the space between routine and opportunity, in a place so ordinary that no one passing through earlier that morning would have given it a second glance. Snow covered the ground in uneven layers, muffling footsteps and softening the sounds of the waking neighborhood. The cold air hung motionless beneath a gray winter sky, and for a few fleeting moments, nothing disturbed the quiet rhythm of Saskatoon. Somewhere nearby, buses followed their routes. Hospital staff prepared for another day. Families continued with breakfast, unaware that only a short distance away, a young woman's life was about to be torn away forever. Gail Miller was only trying to reach work. She had no reason to expect danger. She was following a path she had walked before, surrounded by streets that felt familiar, in daylight that should have offered reassurance. Yet safety is sometimes nothing more than an assumption shared by everyone until the moment it disappears. Investigators would later conclude that Gail was confronted before she ever reached her destination. The evidence suggested that the person responsible had intercepted her somewhere along her route, taking advantage of the isolation created by the winter morning. Whether the attacker had been watching for an opportunity or simply encountered her by chance remains one of the questions history cannot answer with certainty. What became painfully clear, however, was that Gail was targeted by someone willing to use overwhelming violence to accomplish his intentions. The struggle that followed was brief but desperate. Snow can preserve evidence, but it can also erase it. Every fresh gust of wind, every passing hour, every footprint layered over another slowly alters the story left behind. The freezing temperatures that morning concealed as much as they revealed. Detectives would later examine disturbed patches of snow, scattered personal belongings, and the subtle marks that hinted at a violent confrontation. They were not looking at a perfectly preserved crime scene. They were looking at fragments, trying to reconstruct moments that had unfolded in terrifying speed. The attack itself was both sexual and homicidal in nature. Later forensic examination established that Gail had been sexually assaulted before suffering a sustained knife attack. She was stabbed more than 25 times, an extraordinary level of violence that immediately signaled to investigators that this was not an accidental killing or a confrontation that had spiraled unexpectedly out of control. The repeated use of the knife reflected an intensity of violence that shocked even experienced investigators. The physical brutality told only part of the story. The emotional impact spread far beyond the scene itself. Somewhere, Gail's family believed she was already on her way to work. At the hospital, co-workers assumed she had simply been delayed. No one yet understood that her absence was not temporary. The attacker left the scene believing he had escaped unnoticed. In 1969, criminal investigations depended heavily upon eyewitnesses, witness recollections, and physical evidence that could be collected using the technology of the era. DNA profiling did not yet exist. Surveillance cameras were virtually non-existent. Mobile phones capable of recording locations were decades away. A determined offender could disappear into an ordinary neighborhood with frightening ease, particularly during winter when fewer people lingered outdoors. That reality would shape everything that followed. The killer vanished. The city remained unaware. For a short period, normal life continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. It is difficult to comprehend how two realities can exist simultaneously. In one part of the city, people laughed, worked, and planned their evenings. In another, a violent crime had already changed countless lives forever. Tragedy often unfolds this way, invisible until someone stumbles upon the truth. As the morning progressed, concern gradually replaced expectation. Gail failed to arrive where she was supposed to be. At first, there were reasonable explanations. Winter weather delayed buses. Cars became stranded. People occasionally arrived late. No one immediately imagined murder because murder belonged to newspaper headlines, not ordinary Friday mornings. But time has a way of transforming inconvenience into anxiety. Every passing minute quietly increased the distance between hope and reality. Meanwhile, the individual responsible continued moving through the city, blending into daily life. Perhaps he passed strangers who smiled politely. Perhaps he entered a store or returned home. Those ordinary actions make crimes committed by strangers especially unsettling. The person carrying the burden of guilt may appear completely unremarkable to everyone around him. Years later, DNA evidence would identify Larry Fisher as the man responsible. By then, nearly 3 decades had passed. The certainty that eventually accompanied modern forensic science was unavailable to investigators on that January morning. Instead, detectives faced uncertainty, public pressure, and the immense responsibility of identifying someone they had never seen. The violence inflicted upon Gail would become central to understanding the offender's behavior. Criminal profilers who later examined similar cases often noted that excessive stabbing can reflect rage, domination, or a deeply personal need to exert control over a victim. Yet profiling can only suggest possibilities. It cannot identify a specific individual. In Gail's case, the wounds demonstrated the ferocity of the assault but offered little immediate guidance regarding the identity of the attacker. That uncertainty created space for assumptions. And assumptions, once accepted as facts, can become remarkably difficult to challenge. The city did not yet know that another story was unfolding at almost the same time. A teenage traveler named David Milgaard and several companions happened to be passing through Saskatoon during their journey west. Lost in an unfamiliar city, they moved through streets that would later become critically important to the investigation. Their presence was entirely unrelated to the attack itself, yet coincidence has an unsettling way of inserting innocent people into criminal investigations. Neither Gail nor David knew the other existed. Within days, however, their names would become permanently connected. One because she had been murdered. The other because investigators would come to believe he had committed the crime. At the time, no one could foresee how devastating that conclusion would become. The events of that winter morning ended long before police officers arrived. The attack was over. The killer was gone. The silence returned to the snow-covered neighborhood as though nothing had happened. Nature has an unsettling indifference to human tragedy. The wind continued drifting across the streets. Snow continued settling softly onto the ground. The city continued breathing beneath its blanket of winter. Yet beneath that silence lay evidence waiting to be discovered. Every unanswered question rested there, hidden until investigators could begin assembling the scattered pieces. Who had crossed Gail's path? Why had she been chosen? How had the killer escaped so completely? Those questions would dominate the investigation from its earliest hours. Unfortunately, the answers detectives eventually accepted would not be the answers hidden within the evidence itself. The truth remained buried, not because it had disappeared, but because it had not yet been recognized. In the years ahead, courtrooms would hear confident testimony. Prosecutors would present what appeared to be a coherent narrative. Jurors would believe they had reached justice. An innocent teenager would enter prison while the actual killer continued living outside its walls. All of that began here, with a young woman whose ordinary walk to work ended in unimaginable violence. With a frozen morning that concealed more than it revealed. And with a crime scene that held the truth from the very beginning, even though no one yet understood how to read it. The discovery did not happen with dramatic urgency or flashing lights cutting through the winter darkness. It happened quietly, almost reluctantly, as though the frozen city itself resisted revealing what had taken place only hours earlier. Snow continued to blanket the narrow alleyways and residential streets of Saskatoon, preserving an eerie stillness that made the scene feel disconnected from the rest of the world. Life continued only a few blocks away. Children laughed on their way to school. Cars rolled cautiously over icy roads. People hurried into offices and stores with scarves pulled tightly around their faces. They had no idea that a crime scene already existed within their neighborhood. Then someone noticed something that did not belong. At first, it may have appeared to be nothing more than an unusual shape against the snow. Winter has a way of disguising everything. Snow softens sharp edges, buries discarded objects, and transforms familiar landscapes into almost unrecognizable scenes. But as the witness moved closer, uncertainty quickly gave way to horror. A young woman lay motionless in the snow. There are moments that divide a person's life into before and after. For the individual who found Gail Miller, this was undoubtedly one of them. No amount of ordinary routine could prepare someone for such a discovery. The silence surrounding the scene only intensified the shock. There were no cries for help. No struggle remained to interrupt the stillness. Only the bitter prairie wind moved through the alley, carrying with it the cold indifference of a winter morning. Emergency services were contacted immediately. Within minutes, police officers and medical personnel arrived, their vehicles disturbing the untouched snow as they approached. What they encountered was unlike anything most of them had experienced before. The young woman was beyond saving. Medical responders could do little except confirm what had already become painfully obvious. The violence inflicted upon her had been catastrophic. Investigators immediately recognized they were standing at the scene of a homicide. The alley transformed almost instantly. What had been an ordinary passage between residential properties became a carefully protected crime scene. Officers stretched barriers across access points. Curious neighbors gathered at a distance, speaking in hushed voices, trying to understand why police activity had suddenly overwhelmed their normally peaceful neighborhood. Rumors spread faster than facts. Someone whispered that there had been an accident. Another insisted it was a robbery. Others simply watched in silence, sensing that whatever had happened was far more serious than anyone wanted to admit. Experienced detectives soon arrived. The first responsibility of every homicide investigator is deceptively simple: preserve the scene exactly as it exists. Every footprint, every discarded object, every stain in the snow could become critical evidence. Yet winter presents unique challenges. Snow continues falling. Ice melts beneath sunlight. Wind shifts loose material. Each passing minute risks changing the very evidence investigators hope to preserve. Photographs were taken from every possible angle. Measurements were recorded. The position of the body was documented with painstaking precision. Investigators searched the surrounding area inch by inch, knowing that even the smallest overlooked detail could eventually determine whether a murderer would be identified or remain free. They quickly observed signs indicating that the attack had not been accidental or impulsive. The wounds visible on Gail's body reflected extraordinary violence. The scene itself suggested a prolonged assault rather than a brief confrontation. Detectives immediately understood they were dealing with an offender capable of extreme brutality. The forensic capabilities available in 1969, however, were dramatically different from those investigators rely upon today. Modern detectives can recover microscopic DNA, analyze digital communications, examine surveillance footage, reconstruct movements through electronic records, and compare biological evidence against national databases within hours. None of those tools existed for the officers working this case. Instead, they relied on what they could physically observe. Footprints, bloodstains, fibers, personal belongings, witness statements. The hope that someone had seen something unusual. Every observation was carefully documented because each represented one piece of a puzzle whose final image remained completely unknown. Among the earliest priorities was establishing Gail's identity. Once confirmed, investigators began reconstructing her final known movements. They learned she had left home that morning intending to travel to work at the hospital where she served as a nurse's aide. She had never arrived. The route between her home and the bus stop suddenly became one of the most important locations in Saskatchewan. Detectives walked those streets repeatedly. They measured distances. They estimated walking times. They knocked on doors throughout the neighborhood, asking residents the same questions over and over. Did you see Gail this morning? Did you notice anyone unfamiliar? Did you hear shouting? Did you observe any suspicious vehicle? Most answers were frustratingly similar. No. 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 Nothing unusual. The neighborhood had been awake, yet somehow almost no one had witnessed the attack. That fact would haunt investigators throughout the case. How could such a violent crime occur in a residential area during daylight without producing reliable eyewitnesses? The answer may have been painfully simple. Winter changes behavior. People spend less time outdoors. Windows remain closed. Heavy clothing muffles sound. Snow absorbs noise. A brief attack can unfold remarkably unnoticed when everyone else remains inside warm homes preparing for another ordinary day. As forensic specialists continued examining the scene, they recovered physical evidence that would later prove far more significant than anyone realized at the time. Biological material connected to the sexual assault was carefully preserved according to the standards available in 1969. Investigators understood its importance, even though the scientific methods necessary to fully analyze it would not exist for nearly 3 decades. Ironically, the evidence capable of identifying the real killer had already been collected. The technology simply had not yet caught up. Back at police headquarters, maps covered conference tables. Officers marked locations connected to Gail's final movements. Every possible timeline was examined. Every known interaction became relevant. The investigation expanded rapidly. Friends were interviewed. Family members were questioned. Co-workers described Gail's personality, her habits, her relationships, and whether anyone might have wished to harm her. Again and again, investigators encountered the same conclusion. Gail was widely regarded as kind, responsible, and well-liked. There appeared to be no obvious personal motive. No jealous former partner. No ongoing dispute. No known enemy. As that realization settled in, detectives increasingly considered another possibility. Perhaps the attack had been committed by a stranger. Stranger homicides present enormous investigative challenges because they begin without the obvious connections that often guide detectives toward suspects. Instead of following personal relationships, investigators must search an entire community for someone capable of unimaginable violence. Pressure intensified almost immediately. The murder dominated local conversation. Newspapers reported every available detail. Residents demanded answers. Parents warned children not to walk alone. Women altered daily routines that had once felt perfectly safe. The city wanted reassurance that the person responsible would soon be arrested. Police leadership understood that every day without progress risked increasing public fear. Unfortunately, public pressure can subtly reshape investigations. The desire to solve a crime quickly sometimes becomes almost as powerful as the desire to solve it correctly. No detective consciously sets out to accuse an innocent person. Yet investigations are conducted by human beings, and human beings naturally search for patterns that make uncertainty easier to understand. One promising lead can begin attracting more attention than every conflicting fact. One persuasive witness can overshadow several uncertain ones. One theory can gradually become accepted, not because it has been conclusively proven, but because it appears to explain the available evidence. The Gail Miller investigation had not yet reached that stage. But it was moving in that direction. Only hours after the discovery of her body, another seemingly unrelated event quietly entered the investigation. Police learned that a small group of young travelers had been passing through Saskatoon around the same time as the murder. Among them was 16-year-old David Milgaard. Initially, this information meant very little. Travelers pass through cities every day. Being nearby does not imply guilt. Yet investigators documented their presence, believing it deserved further examination. No one realized that this simple observation would eventually redirect the entire investigation. As detectives continued processing evidence from the crime scene, the biological samples recovered from Gail's clothing and body were carefully stored. Those items would spend years inside evidence lockers, largely forgotten after a conviction appeared to resolve the case. But evidence possesses remarkable patience. Unlike witnesses, it does not forget. Unlike memories, it does not change. Unlike assumptions, it does not care who investigators believe is guilty. It simply waits for someone capable of understanding what it has been saying all along. On that cold January afternoon, however, the future remained invisible. Detectives believed the answers were still somewhere inside Saskatoon. The public believed an arrest was only a matter of time. Gail's family believed justice would soon arrive. None of them knew that the most important evidence had already been collected, the real killer was still free, and the investigation was about to take a path that would keep the truth buried for nearly 30 years. The first days of a homicide investigation are often the most dangerous, not because the killer is necessarily close, but because every new piece of information has the power to shape the direction of the entire case. Once investigators begin building a theory, every interview, every report, and every decision risks being filtered through that single narrative. In the murder of Gail Miller, the search for answers slowly transformed into a search for confirmation. What began as an open investigation gradually narrowed until one teenage traveler became the center of a story that detectives believed they had solved. Police continued interviewing everyone connected to Gail's final hours. Family members, co-workers, neighbors, and anyone who might have crossed paths with her that morning were questioned repeatedly. Detectives searched for motives, past conflicts, suspicious acquaintances, and any indication that someone in her personal life had wanted to harm her. Nothing substantial emerged. Gail had no known enemies. There was no evidence suggesting an abusive relationship, ongoing threats, or personal disputes capable of explaining the extraordinary violence of the crime. The absence of an obvious suspect forced investigators to widen their focus beyond her immediate circle. It was during that expanding search that attention turned toward a group of teenagers traveling across Western Canada. Among them was 16-year-old David Milgaard. David and his friends had been driving from Regina toward Vancouver. Like many young people chasing adventure during the late 1960s, they were more concerned with reaching the West Coast than leaving behind detailed records of every stop they made along the journey. Their route unexpectedly brought them into Saskatoon on the morning Gail was murdered. They became lost while navigating unfamiliar streets. That simple fact would eventually change David's life forever. Being near the crime scene during the estimated time of the murder naturally attracted police interest. Detectives wanted to establish exactly where the teenagers had traveled, how long they had remained in the area, and whether any of them had observed unusual activity. Initially, David was simply one witness among many. He was not the only person questioned. He was not immediately considered the killer. But investigations often evolve one interview at a time. The group was questioned separately. As detectives compared individual accounts, they noticed inconsistencies. Some memories differed regarding timing. Others differed regarding specific streets or stops along the route. Such inconsistencies are remarkably common, particularly when several people attempt to reconstruct an ordinary morning weeks after it occurred. Human memory is not a video recording. It reconstructs events imperfectly, filling gaps with assumptions and impressions. Yet in criminal investigations, inconsistencies often appear suspicious. The more detectives questioned the teenagers, the more they began believing that someone within the group knew more than they admitted. That belief intensified when one of David's companions, Albert Cadrain, made a statement that dramatically shifted the investigation. Cadrain told investigators he believed he had seen blood on David's trousers later that morning. The statement immediately captured detectives' attention. Blood. Near the time of a brutal stabbing. To investigators already searching for a viable suspect, it seemed significant. But statements made during criminal investigations are rarely as straightforward as they first appear. Questions soon emerged. How much blood had actually been seen? Could it have originated from another source? Was the observation made immediately after the alleged event, or remembered only later? Memory itself can become surprisingly vulnerable once investigators communicate their suspicions. Witnesses may begin unintentionally reshaping uncertain recollections into confident narratives, particularly after repeated interviews. Over time, additional members of the traveling group modified portions of their own accounts. Some details changed. New recollections appeared. Certain statements became increasingly damaging to David. From the perspective of prosecutors, the pieces now seemed to fit together. A teenager had been near the scene. One companion claimed to have observed blood. Other witnesses offered testimony that appeared to support growing suspicions. There was still no murder weapon directly connecting David to the crime. No fingerprint evidence conclusively identifying him as the attacker. No biological testing capable of confirming his involvement. But in 1969, those limitations did not necessarily prevent prosecution. Circumstantial evidence, combined with witness testimony, often carried enormous weight. As investigators concentrated more intensely on David, another subtle change occurred. Alternative possibilities began receiving less attention. This phenomenon, now widely recognized within criminal psychology as confirmation bias, does not require dishonesty or malicious intent. Once investigators sincerely believe they have identified the correct suspect, new information is often interpreted through that belief. Evidence supporting the theory appears stronger. Evidence contradicting it receives less emphasis. Years later, legal scholars examining the Gail Miller investigation would identify this as one of the defining weaknesses of the case. At the time, however, detectives believed they were following the evidence. David consistently denied involvement. From the very beginning, he insisted he had not attacked Gail Miller. He acknowledged traveling through Saskatoon. He acknowledged being present in the city. But he denied committing murder. His denials did little to slow the investigation. As public pressure intensified, authorities faced growing demands to solve one of the city's most disturbing crimes. Newspapers continued reporting developments. Residents wanted reassurance that the killer would not strike again. The investigation increasingly revolved around a single question. Could David Milgaard be the murderer? Eventually, police answered that question with confidence. Yes. Charges followed. For Gail's grieving family, the arrest appeared to represent progress toward justice. For the public, it suggested that police had successfully identified the person responsible. For David and his family, it marked the beginning of a nightmare that would last more than 2 decades. Preparing for trial required prosecutors to construct a coherent narrative explaining not only why David had been present but how he had allegedly committed the crime. Witness testimony became the foundation of that narrative. Albert Cadrain's account regarding the bloodstained trousers assumed enormous importance. Other testimony from members of the traveling group reinforced portions of the prosecution's theory. Each witness contributed another piece of the story presented to the jury. Yet beneath the apparent certainty lay significant vulnerabilities. Human memory changes over time. Repeated questioning can influence recollection. Stress affects perception. People exposed to media coverage may unknowingly incorporate outside information into their own memories. None of these realities necessarily mean witnesses are lying. Quite often, they sincerely believe the accuracy of what they remember. That sincerity can make mistaken testimony especially persuasive. Jurors generally expect eyewitnesses to tell the truth. The difficulty lies in recognizing that truthful people can still be mistaken. During the trial, prosecutors argued that the collective testimony established David's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense challenged those conclusions, emphasizing inconsistencies and the absence of conclusive physical evidence directly connecting David to the murder. But forensic science in 1970 could not answer the questions that modern DNA testing would eventually resolve. The biological evidence recovered from Gail's body remained scientifically silent. Not because it lacked information. Because the necessary technology had not yet been invented. The jury never heard DNA evidence excluding David. No such evidence existed yet. Instead, they weighed witness testimony, investigative conclusions, and circumstantial facts that appeared persuasive within the limits of contemporary forensic science. When the verdict arrived, David Milgaard was convicted of rape and murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was only 16 years old. For Gail's family, the conviction likely offered some measure of closure. After months of grief and uncertainty, the justice system assured them the man responsible had been identified and punished. For investigators, the case appeared solved. Files were closed. Attention shifted elsewhere. Life moved forward. Only one problem remained. The wrong man had gone to prison. While David entered a correctional institution insisting upon his innocence, the individual who had actually attacked Gail Miller remained free. Larry Fisher was never seriously pursued during those early years. He continued living his life beyond the walls that confined an innocent teenager. That hidden truth would remain buried for decades. The evidence capable of exposing it sat quietly inside police storage, preserved but scientifically unreadable. The witnesses believed what they had testified. The detectives believed their investigation had succeeded. The prosecutors believed justice had been achieved. The jury believed it had reached the correct decision. Sometimes a wrongful conviction does not arise from one catastrophic mistake. Sometimes it emerges from dozens of smaller assumptions, each appearing reasonable on its own, until together they create an illusion so convincing that almost everyone accepts it as fact. Almost everyone. David Milgaard never did. Year after year, from behind prison walls, he continued saying the same words. He was innocent. Few people listened. Fewer still believed him. But the truth has an extraordinary quality. It does not disappear simply because a courtroom rejects it. It waits. Patiently. Silently. Until someone finally uncovers it. More than 2 decades passed before the case began to change. By then, the snow that had covered Saskatoon on the morning of January 31, 1969, had melted and returned countless times. Neighborhoods had changed. New families had moved into old houses. Police officers who first responded to the crime scene had retired. Some witnesses struggled to remember details that had once seemed unforgettable. The murder of Gail Miller had become part of Canadian legal history, remembered as a tragic case that had supposedly been solved years earlier. Except one person refused to let it end. Inside prison walls, David Milgaard never stopped maintaining his innocence. Years of incarceration can break even the strongest individuals. Prison strips away ordinary markers of time. Birthdays pass unnoticed. Holidays lose their meaning. Families grow older through letters and brief visits. Children become adults. Parents age behind the glass separating visitor from inmate. For someone serving a life sentence, hope becomes both a necessity and a burden. Every failed appeal threatens to extinguish it completely. David experienced that reality year after year. He appealed. He wrote letters. He spoke to journalists. He insisted that investigators had arrested the wrong man. Many dismissed his claims as the predictable protests of a convicted murderer. Innocence is easy to declare, people argued. Countless prisoners insist they were wrongly convicted. But David never changed his story. Not after 1 year. Not after 10. Not after 20. Outside prison, another person refused to surrender. His mother, Joyce Milgaard, transformed herself from an ordinary parent into one of Canada's most determined advocates for justice. She traveled across the country, spoke with reporters, contacted lawyers, and challenged a legal system that had already declared her son guilty. She faced criticism, skepticism, and repeated disappointment, yet she continued pushing forward with extraordinary persistence. Her campaign was never simply about convincing people that David deserved sympathy. It was about convincing them that the evidence deserved another look. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, scientific advances began transforming criminal investigations around the world. DNA profiling emerged as one of the most revolutionary forensic tools ever developed. Unlike eyewitness testimony, DNA did not forget. Unlike memories, it did not become distorted over time. Unlike assumptions, it carried no emotional investment in a particular theory. It simply identified biological truth. Across North America, investigators began reopening older homicide cases where preserved biological evidence still existed. Some convictions were confirmed with remarkable precision. Others began falling apart. Lawyers representing David Milgaard recognized that Gail Miller's case contained biological evidence collected during the original investigation. Although those samples had been stored for decades, modern forensic science offered something investigators in 1969 had never possessed: the ability to identify the source of biological material with extraordinary accuracy. Obtaining permission to conduct DNA testing was neither simple nor immediate. Legal systems are naturally cautious about reopening finalized murder convictions. Every request required careful review. Every delay meant more time passing for a man who had already spent decades behind bars. Eventually, however, testing moved forward. The preserved evidence was submitted for forensic analysis. Then everyone waited. 4 investigators, prosecutors, defense lawyers, and Gail's family. The results carried enormous significance. If the DNA matched David, it would finally silence years of controversy surrounding the conviction. If it excluded him, everything would change. The laboratory examined the biological evidence using techniques unavailable to the original investigators. Unlike the forensic limitations of 1969, modern DNA analysis could compare genetic profiles with extraordinary precision. When the results arrived, they delivered a conclusion that stunned the Canadian justice system. The DNA did not belong to David Milgaard. The biological evidence recovered from Gail Miller's clothing excluded him completely. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, scientific evidence directly contradicted the foundation of the original prosecution. The implications were staggering. If David's DNA was absent, whose DNA had investigators preserved all those years? That question redirected the investigation back to where it should have begun: the evidence itself. Rather than asking how David committed the crime, investigators now asked an entirely different question: who actually attacked Gail Miller? The unknown DNA profile became the investigation's most important lead. As forensic databases expanded and investigators reviewed potential suspects connected to violent sexual offenses, attention eventually focused on a man whose history immediately raised alarming questions: Larry Fisher. Unlike David Milgaard, Fisher had a documented history of violent sexual crimes. More importantly, he had lived near the area where Gail was attacked in 1969. 4 years, his name had never occupied the center of the investigation. Now, modern science placed him there. Investigators obtained a DNA sample from Fisher. The comparison was straightforward. Either the profiles matched, or they did not. When forensic scientists completed the analysis, there was little room for interpretation. The DNA recovered from Gail Miller matched Larry Fisher. Nearly 28 years after the murder, the physical evidence had finally identified the man who had left it behind. The evidence had remained truthful from the very beginning. Human beings had simply lacked the technology to understand it. The revelation sent shockwaves throughout Canada. David Milgaard's conviction could no longer be defended. The scientific evidence excluded him while directly implicating another man. Years of assumptions, witness testimony, and investigative certainty collapsed beneath a single genetic profile. The case that had once appeared closed was suddenly one of the most significant wrongful convictions in Canadian history. For David, the moment was almost impossible to comprehend. After spending 23 years imprisoned for a crime he did not commit, science had finally confirmed what he had repeated since the day of his arrest. He was innocent. Freedom, however, did not erase the years already lost. No laboratory could return missed birthdays. No court ruling could restore decades separated from family. No legal decision could rebuild the life interrupted when he was only 16 years old. Justice had arrived. But it had arrived painfully late. For Gail Miller's family, the DNA results created an entirely different kind of heartbreak. For years they had believed the legal process had delivered accountability. Now they learned the man convicted of killing Gail had not been her murderer. That realization forced them to relive the loss all over again. The case they believed had ended in 1970 had never truly been solved. The real killer had remained free for decades. Police reopened the investigation with renewed urgency. Witness statements from decades earlier were reviewed. Old reports were re-examined. Investigators traced Larry Fisher's history, comparing his known behavior with the evidence recovered in Gail's case. The similarities were deeply disturbing. He had demonstrated a pattern of violent sexual offending. He had lived in close proximity to the crime scene. And now the DNA connected him directly to the biological evidence preserved from the assault. Unlike the circumstantial case built against David Milgaard, the evidence against Fisher rested upon objective forensic science. The investigation that had once relied heavily upon uncertain memories now possessed something far more reliable. Genetic proof. Forensic experts emphasized the significance of the discovery. DNA did not merely suggest another possible suspect. It fundamentally disproved the central premise of the original conviction. The biological evidence left during the assault belonged to Larry Fisher, not David Milgaard. The wrong man had spent 23 years in prison while the right man remained free. The consequences extended far beyond a single case. Legal scholars, police organizations, and forensic experts across Canada began examining how such an error had occurred. Questions emerged regarding eyewitness reliability, investigative bias, disclosure practices, the importance of preserving biological evidence, and the growing role DNA would play in preventing future miscarriages of justice. What began as one murder investigation had evolved into a national lesson about the fallibility of criminal investigations conducted without adequate forensic tools and without sufficient safeguards against confirmation bias. Yet amid those broader discussions, one truth remained unchanged. None of these revelations could restore Gail Miller's life. Science had identified her killer. It had freed an innocent man. But it could not undo the violence committed on that freezing January morning. The DNA had answered the question everyone had asked for nearly 30 years. It had also revealed an even more painful reality. Justice delayed is never justice denied completely. But it is never whole. Because every year lost to error becomes another wound that no verdict, no apology, and no scientific breakthrough can ever fully heal. When the courtroom doors opened for what would become the final legal chapter of the Gail Miller case, the atmosphere inside was very different from the one that had existed nearly 3 decades earlier. Time had reshaped everything. Faces were older. Voices carried the weight of experience. The confidence that once defined the original conviction had been replaced by something far more complicated, something closer to collective reflection than certainty. This was no longer a trial about establishing guilt. It was a reckoning with the consequences of believing certainty too quickly. The man at the center of this new chapter, Larry Fisher, was not a mystery to the legal system anymore. Unlike the fragile circumstantial case that had once been built against David Milgaard, the evidence now presented against Fisher came from a source that did not depend on memory, interpretation, or human perception. It came from biology itself. From material left behind in the most violent and intimate moment of the crime. Evidence that had waited silently for nearly 30 years to be understood. The courtroom was filled with a tension that felt different from a typical criminal trial. There was no dramatic uncertainty about identity. The question was not whether Gail Miller had been murdered. That had been established decades earlier. The question was not even whether a violent crime had occurred. That, too, was beyond dispute. The question now centered on responsibility, and the uncomfortable truth that responsibility had been misassigned for most of the intervening years. Prosecutors presented their case with a focus that reflected modern forensic confidence. They walked the court through the chain of evidence, beginning with the original preservation of biological samples from the 1969 crime scene. Each step of handling, storage, and later testing was explained carefully, emphasizing the integrity of the materials despite the passage of time. What had once been limited by scientific capability was now being re-examined through technology that offered a level of precision unimaginable to the original investigators. The DNA results became the focal point of everything. There was no ambiguity in the scientific conclusion. The genetic material recovered from Gail Miller's body matched Larry Fisher. Not partially. Not suggestively. Fully. Directly. In a way that excluded all other known possibilities presented in the case. In contrast, the same evidence that had once been used to convict David Milgaard now excluded him entirely. The biological profile did not belong to him. It had never belonged to him. In a courtroom built on legal language, this type of scientific certainty carries extraordinary weight. DNA does not speculate. It does not interpret motive. It does not rely on perception shaped by fear or pressure. It identifies presence with statistical clarity that leaves almost no room for doubt. As the prosecution presented this evidence, the emotional undertone in the courtroom shifted. This was no longer just about one offender being held accountable. It was about the exposure of a historical failure that had allowed the wrong man to be imprisoned while the true perpetrator remained free. Larry Fisher listened as the evidence unfolded. Unlike many defendants whose guilt is built from inference, his connection to the crime was now anchored in forensic science that placed him directly at the scene. The biological evidence spoke in a way witness testimony never could. It did not change under questioning. It did not weaken with time. It remained fixed. The defense, facing the overwhelming nature of the DNA evidence, had little room to construct an alternative explanation. There was no competing scientific theory capable of displacing the genetic match. Instead, the courtroom focus shifted toward procedural considerations, the passage of time, and the circumstances under which earlier investigations had failed to identify Fisher. But those arguments could not alter the central reality emerging in real time. The evidence from Gail Miller's body had finally identified her attacker. As the proceedings continued, attention repeatedly returned to the broader implications of the case. Because this trial was not occurring in isolation. It was happening in the shadow of one of the most significant wrongful convictions in Canadian history. Every piece of evidence presented against Fisher simultaneously highlighted the injustice experienced by David Milgaard. The courtroom could not ignore that dual reality. On one side stood the scientific identification of the true offender. On the other stood the acknowledgement that a teenager had spent more than 2 decades in prison for a crime he did not commit. When the verdict was ultimately delivered, it confirmed what the DNA evidence had already established. Larry Fisher was found guilty of the murder of Gail Miller. The conviction was based not on uncertain recollections from decades earlier, but on biological evidence that directly linked him to the crime scene. The sentence that followed reflected the severity of the crime and the clarity of the forensic proof. Fisher was sentenced to life imprisonment, ensuring he would never again pose a threat outside of prison walls. For the legal system, this marked the formal closure of the case against the correct offender. Forensic science had achieved what earlier investigative methods had failed to do. But legal closure and emotional closure rarely align. For Gail Miller's family, the courtroom verdict brought a complex mixture of relief and renewed grief. The man responsible for her death had finally been identified and held accountable. That truth mattered. It mattered deeply. Yet it also forced them to revisit the original trauma, knowing that for nearly 30 years, justice had not been correctly served. They had lived for decades believing the case had been resolved in 1970. Now they understood that the resolution they had accepted was incomplete. The real truth had been waiting, buried beneath the limitations of earlier investigative methods. For David Milgaard, the courtroom outcome represented something both liberating and devastating. It confirmed his innocence in the most definitive way possible. It validated everything he and his mother had fought for over decades. But it also underscored the irreversible cost of that injustice. 23 years of his life could not be recovered. Freedom, when it finally arrived, came with the weight of time that could never be returned. When he was released, there was no simple transition back into life. The world he re-entered was not the same world he had left as a teenager. Technology had changed. Society had changed. His family had changed. He had changed. Reintegration after such a long period of wrongful imprisonment is not a return to normality. It is the construction of an entirely new existence built on the fragments of a stolen past. The government eventually issued an official apology and provided financial compensation, acknowledging the profound failure of the justice system in his case. But even official recognition could not translate into restoration. Compensation can acknowledge harm. It cannot erase it. The broader justice system also began to reflect on the implications of what had occurred. The Milgaard case became a defining example in discussions about wrongful convictions, particularly in relation to eyewitness reliability, investigative tunnel vision, and the importance of preserving and re-examining forensic evidence. It demonstrated how strongly an investigation can move toward a conclusion once a theory begins to feel convincing, and how difficult it can be to step back from that conclusion even when uncertainty remains. It also demonstrated something equally important: that evidence does not lose its truth over time. Only the ability to interpret it can lag behind. In the end, the courtroom did more than convict a killer. It revealed the limits of human certainty within the justice system. It showed how easily confidence can be mistaken for correctness when information is incomplete. And it showed how science, even decades later, can reshape what was once believed to be settled truth. As the judge concluded the proceedings, there was no sense of triumph in the room. There was accountability, yes. There was closure in a legal sense. But there was also an awareness that justice had arrived too late to fully heal what had been broken. Gail Miller's life had been taken in a matter of minutes on a winter morning. David Milgaard's life had been taken in slow motion over more than 2 decades. And the truth, waiting silently in biological evidence all along, had finally spoken clearly enough for the world to hear it. But nothing in that courtroom could undo the silence of the years it had taken to be understood. After the courtroom doors closed and the final appeals were exhausted, the case of Gail Miller no longer belonged only to investigators, lawyers, or forensic scientists. It belonged to memory, to history, and to the people whose lives had been permanently altered by a chain of events that began on a freezing January morning in Saskatoon. In the aftermath of legal resolution, what remained was not closure in the simple sense that people often imagine, but something far more complicated: the quiet, ongoing weight of consequences that continue long after a case is declared finished. For Gail Miller's family, time had not moved in a straight line since her death. The initial grief of 1969 had been followed by decades of believing the justice system had identified her killer. That belief, while painful, had at least provided structure to their loss. It gave the tragedy a defined endpoint in legal terms. But when DNA evidence later revealed that David Milgaard had been wrongfully convicted, that structure collapsed. They were forced to confront the reality that the story they had been told for nearly 30 years was incomplete. That realization created a unique form of emotional fracture. It did not replace the original grief, it layered itself on top of it. The loss of Gail remained unchanged. She was still gone. She would still never return. But now there was also the unsettling awareness that justice had taken a long detour before reaching the correct destination. For many families of victims, justice is not only about punishment. It is about certainty. It is about knowing that the person responsible has been correctly identified. When that certainty is disrupted decades later, It reopens wounds that time had partially quieted but never fully healed. For David Milgaard, life after exoneration was not simply a return to freedom. It was the beginning of a new and unfamiliar existence shaped by absence. 23 years had passed while he was incarcerated. Those years contained entire eras of human experience that he did not live through in the normal way. Relationships formed and ended without him. Technological revolutions occurred without him. Families grew older without him. When he was finally released, he stepped into a world that had continued moving forward without waiting. Exoneration removed the legal label of guilt, but it did not erase the psychological imprint of incarceration. The habits of survival learned in prison do not disappear overnight. Nor does the emotional impact of being repeatedly told, for decades, that one is guilty of a crime one did not commit. Reintegration into society after wrongful imprisonment is not a simple transition. It is a long process of rebuilding identity from fragments of a life interrupted. Financial compensation and official apologies acknowledged the wrongdoing, but they could not restore lost time. There is no mechanism in any justice system that can return a man to his teenage years. No legal remedy that can reconstruct the life path that was diverted. What remained for David was not a restored past, but a reconstructed future built in the shadow of what had been taken. For the broader public, the case became something larger than the individuals directly involved. It became a reference point in discussions about how justice systems function under pressure, and how easily certainty can form in the absence of complete information. The murder of Gail Miller and the wrongful conviction of David Milgaard are now studied together, not because they are the same event, but because they are inseparably linked within the same chain of errors and revelations. The case highlighted a fundamental tension within criminal investigations, the need to act quickly versus the need to remain uncertain long enough to avoid irreversible mistakes. Investigators in 1969 did not have access to DNA technology. They worked within the limits of their time, relying on eyewitness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and human interpretation. Those tools are not inherently unreliable, but they are vulnerable to distortion. Memory changes. Perception shifts. Assumptions solidify into belief. One of the most important lessons drawn from this case is how easily investigative focus can narrow. Once a suspect becomes the center of attention, every new piece of information risks being interpreted through the lens of that suspicion. Evidence that does not fit may be discounted. Alternative possibilities may receive less attention. Over time, the investigation can become less about discovering truth and more about confirming a conclusion that already feels established. The Milgaard case became a defining example of this phenomenon. It showed how multiple reasonable steps, taken individually, can collectively lead to a deeply incorrect outcome. No single decision alone explains the wrongful conviction. Instead, it was the accumulation of assumptions, reinforced by human psychology and procedural limitations, that created a path toward error. The introduction of DNA evidence years later did more than identify Larry Fisher as the true offender. It fundamentally changed how the justice system understood certainty itself. DNA does not replace investigation, but it provides a form of verification that is not dependent on human memory or interpretation. In this case, it acted as a corrective force, exposing the gap between perceived truth and factual truth. For law enforcement and legal institutions, the implications were profound. Procedures for evidence preservation, standards for witness evaluation, and approaches to reviewing old convictions began to evolve. The case became part of training discussions, academic research, and policy reform conversations. It stood as a reminder that finality in law does not always mean accuracy, and that some cases require revisiting when new scientific tools become available. Yet even with all these systemic lessons, the human reality remains the most difficult part to process. Gail Miller was a young woman walking to work on a winter morning. Her life was not defined by the investigation, the trial, or the forensic evidence. It was defined by the relationships she had, the work she did, and the future she never had the chance to live. True crime narratives often risk reducing victims to the circumstances of their death. But behind every case file is a full human life that existed independently of the crime. Her death became a catalyst for legal reform and forensic advancement, but it was first and foremost a personal tragedy that affected those who knew her in ways that cannot be measured through legal outcomes. Larry Fisher's conviction ensured that the legal responsibility for that tragedy was finally placed on the correct individual. But even that resolution exists within a larger truth. Legal outcomes, no matter how accurate, cannot restore what was lost. The final reflection that emerges from this case is not one of triumph, but of awareness. Awareness of how fragile certainty can be when built on incomplete information. Awareness of how powerful scientific advancement can be in correcting past mistakes. And awareness that justice, while capable of reaching the truth, does not always arrive in time to prevent profound harm. In the end, the story of Gail Miller is not only about a crime, and not only about a wrongful conviction. It is about the distance between what is believed and what is true, and the human cost of discovering that distance too late. Some cases end with resolution. This one ends with understanding. And understanding, while essential, is not the same as healing. The final layer of the Gail Miller case is not found in court transcripts or forensic reports, but in the way time itself reshaped everything around it. Years after the verdicts, after the DNA results, after the headlines faded and the legal system moved on to other cases, what remained was a quiet reminder that justice is not a single moment of resolution. It is a long and imperfect process that sometimes corrects itself, but never without leaving traces of what came before. Saskatoon continued to grow and change. Streets that once knew only winter silence became busier, more developed, filled with new generations who had no direct memory of the events that once defined a city's darkest chapter. Life, as it always does, continued forward without waiting for the past to settle neatly into place. But in the background of that normalcy, the story of Gail Miller never fully disappeared. It became part of the city's legal and moral history, a case referenced whenever discussions turned to wrongful convictions, forensic science, or the responsibilities of investigative certainty. For Gail's family and loved ones, time did not erase the loss. It softened certain edges, but it never removed the absence itself. There is a particular kind of silence that follows violent loss, one that does not end even after decades. It becomes part of the family's internal landscape. Life continues around it, but it never fully leaves. The passage of years may bring adaptation, but not replacement. Gail remained, in memory, at 20 years old, forever paused at the point where her future was taken from her. For David Milgaard, the end of the legal battle marked the beginning of a different kind of journey. Freedom, after decades of wrongful imprisonment, is not a return to what once was. It is the construction of something entirely new under conditions shaped by what was lost. He entered a world that had moved on without him, carrying memories of confinement that could not simply be set aside. His life after exoneration became, in many ways, a search for meaning beyond the identity imposed on him by a wrongful conviction. What defined him most in the years that followed was not only what had happened to him, but what he chose to do with that experience. He became involved in advocating for criminal justice reform and raising awareness about wrongful convictions. His story was not presented as a spectacle, but as a warning and a lesson. It highlighted how easily systems built by human beings can fail when certainty is allowed to replace caution, and when speed is valued over accuracy. The justice system itself also changed in subtle but lasting ways. The Gail Miller case, alongside other wrongful convictions, contributed to a growing recognition of the importance of DNA evidence, not as a replacement for traditional investigation, but as a safeguard against irreversible error. Procedures for preserving biological evidence became more standardized. Appeals based on new forensic technology became more accepted. The idea that a case could be closed forever began to be replaced with the understanding that truth can sometimes emerge decades later. But perhaps the most important lesson from this case is not procedural. It is human. It is the recognition that certainty, when it arrives too early, can be dangerous. Investigators in 1969 were not careless or malicious. They were operating within the limits of their time, under pressure, using the tools available to them. Yet those limitations, combined with human psychology, created a path that led to a devastating error. Once a narrative formed around David Milgaard, it became increasingly difficult for alternative possibilities to remain in focus. Evidence was interpreted through expectation. Witness memory was shaped by repetition. The investigation, without anyone consciously intending it, narrowed until only one outcome seemed possible. Then science reopened what had been closed. DNA did not simply identify Larry Fisher. It disrupted the assumption that truth had already been found. It demonstrated that evidence can exist long before it can be understood, and that the absence of technological capability does not mean the absence of truth. It also revealed something more uncomfortable, that justice systems are not immune to correction, but they are often slow to recognize when correction is necessary. Larry Fisher's conviction closed the legal question of responsibility, but it did not erase the years during which responsibility had been misassigned. His identification as the true perpetrator restored accuracy to the record, but it could not reverse the lived consequences of the error that preceded it. In the end, the case leaves behind a layered truth. A young woman lost her life in a violent act that changed many others forever. An innocent teenager lost more than 2 decades to a conviction built on incomplete understanding. A justice system eventually corrected itself through science, but only after irreversible damage had already been done. And a society was forced to confront the reality that certainty is not the same as truth, and that the appearance of resolution can sometimes conceal unresolved error. What remains is not a simple conclusion, but a continued responsibility. To question assumptions. To preserve evidence with care. To remain aware that memory is fragile, and that human judgment, no matter how well-intentioned, is limited. The story of Gail Miller does not end with a single moment of closure. It continues as a reminder, embedded within legal history and collective memory, that justice is not only about finding answers, but about ensuring those answers are reached correctly, even if it takes longer than anyone wishes. Because in the space between certainty and truth, lives can be lost twice, once through violence, and again through error. And the responsibility of remembering that difference is what remains long after the case itself has ended. That I end the structure we built, but I understand what you're aiming for, a final layer that feels like an echo after the story has already ended, something that doesn't move the plot forward, but lingers in the mind like cold air after a door has closed. Years after the case was officially resolved, what remained was not the sound of courtroom arguments or the urgency of investigation, but silence. The kind of silence that settles only after every document has been filed, every appeal exhausted, and every headline forgotten. In that silence, the story of Gail Miller stopped being an active case and became something more permanent. It became memory embedded in systems, taught not as an isolated tragedy, but as an example of how fragile certainty can be when it is built without complete understanding. For the justice system, the case did not simply end with a conviction or an exoneration. It became a reference point that quietly influenced how future investigations were approached. Evidence preservation, once treated as routine storage, gained new importance. The idea that biological material collected in one decade could become decisive decades later began to reshape investigative thinking. What once might have been considered irrelevant after a conviction was now understood as something that could one day correct an entire historical record. Inside police departments and legal institutions, the case was discussed not as a story of failure alone, but as a reminder of structural vulnerability. Not because individuals acted with bad intent, but because systems built on human interpretation will always carry the risk of misdirection when certainty forms too early. The investigation into Gail Miller's death became a case study in how easily a narrative can become stronger than the evidence meant to test it. For those studying criminal justice, the most haunting aspect is not that a mistake was made, but how ordinary the path to that mistake looked at every step. Nothing in the early investigation appeared extreme or reckless. Witness statements were gathered. Suspects were interviewed. A theory formed gradually, reinforced by repetition and proximity. Each decision, viewed alone, seemed reasonable. It is only when viewed as a whole that the trajectory becomes visible. A straight line drawn through uncertainty until it points in the wrong direction. The DNA evidence that eventually corrected the case did more than identify Larry Fisher. It exposed the gap between perception and reality in a way that could not be ignored. It showed that truth can exist quietly for decades without recognition, not because it is hidden, but because the tools needed to see it have not yet arrived. That realization changed how many later cases were handled, not because it eliminated error, but because it made the possibility of error impossible to ignore. For Gail Miller's memory, time did something both painful and inevitable. It preserved her name, but not her life beyond the moment it was taken. She remains, in public record and collective memory, forever associated with the day she did not return home. Yet within her family and those who knew her personally, she remains something more complete than a case file can ever express. A daughter whose presence once filled ordinary spaces. A young woman whose future was interrupted before it could fully take shape. For David Milgaard, the passage of time after exoneration carried a different kind of weight. Freedom did not erase the structure that years of wrongful imprisonment had built around his life. Instead, it required him to rebuild identity in a world that had continued without him. He became part of a larger conversation about justice, not as a symbol alone, but as a living reminder that correction, when it arrives too late, still matters, even if it cannot restore what was lost. There is a temptation in true crime storytelling to search for clean endings. To imagine that once the truth is known, everything resolves into balance. But this case resists that temptation. The truth did arrive. The wrong was corrected. The system acknowledged its failure. And yet nothing returned to the state it might have been in if the truth had been known from the beginning. That is the final reality this case leaves behind. Justice, even when it eventually reaches accuracy, does not travel backward in time. It cannot restore the years lost in error. It cannot return a life interrupted or rebuild the version of events that should have unfolded. It can only adjust the record moving forward, ensuring that what is written going ahead reflects reality more closely than before. The story of Gail Miller ends, in a legal sense, with resolution. But in a human sense, it ends differently. It ends as a reminder that truth and time do not always arrive together, and when they do not, the distance between them is measured in lives altered permanently by the gap. And long after the case is closed, that distance remains the most important thing to remember. The structure we built, and stretching this further into numbered extra parts would only repeat what has already been said. The truth was found, but it arrived too late to undo what had been done. So instead of continuing the numbering, this final section works as the last echo of the story, the moment after the narrator stops speaking, when the case file is closed, but the questions still sit quietly in the air. When people look back at the murder of Gail Miller today, they often focus on the DNA breakthrough or the wrongful conviction. Those are the points where the story becomes visible in headlines and legal textbooks. But the most important part of the case is not the moment science corrected the record. It is everything that happened before correction became possible. A young woman walked to work on a winter morning and never came home. That fact alone would have been a tragedy in any circumstance. Everything that followed only expanded the circle of loss outward, touching people who never met her, and a man who had nothing to do with her death but spent more than 2 decades paying the price for it. Cases like this force an uncomfortable recognition. Justice is not a single event. It is a process that depends on the tools available at the time, the assumptions made under pressure, and the willingness to revisit conclusions when new information appears. When any of those elements fail, the result is not just an incorrect verdict. It is a rewritten human life. There is a quiet detail in this case that often gets overlooked. For nearly 30 years, the biological evidence that eventually solved everything already existed. It was never missing. It was never destroyed. It was sitting in storage, silent and unchanged, while the world built a completely different story around it. That silence is what makes the case so unsettling. The truth was not absent. It was simply unreadable. This is where the real lesson of the case lives. Not in the conviction. Not in the exoneration. But in the space between them, where certainty was built without full understanding, and where that certainty became stronger than the caution that should have balanced it. It is easy, looking back, to say things should have been done differently. But the reality is more uncomfortable. Every step in the original investigation was taken by people trying to solve a violent crime with limited tools and limited time. They were not working with hindsight. They were working with urgency, pressure, and incomplete information. That is exactly what makes wrongful convictions so difficult to confront. They are rarely born from a single obvious failure. They are built from ordinary decisions that only reveal their consequences much later. For Gail Miller's family, the passage of time did not change the central absence in their lives. The identity of the offender changed. The legal narrative changed. The scientific understanding changed. But the loss itself remained fixed at the moment it occurred. No correction in a courtroom can move a life back into existence. It can only clarify responsibility for its absence. For David Milgaard, the correction meant something equally complex. It was vindication, but not restoration. It confirmed what he had always said, but it also marked the point where his lost years became permanent history rather than an ongoing struggle to overturn. Exoneration ended the injustice in law, but not in experience. And for the justice system, the case became something it could not ignore. Not because it was unique in the existence of error, but because it was so clear once the truth finally emerged. It demonstrated how easily confidence can form, how quickly alternatives can fade, and how long a mistake can survive when it is never properly challenged by the right kind of evidence. In the end, the murder of Gail Miller is not only a story about a crime or a conviction. It is a story about the limits of understanding at a given moment in time, and the consequences of acting as if that moment contains everything that needs to be known. Some cases are remembered because they were solved quickly. Others are remembered because they were never truly solved at first. This one is remembered because both of those things are true at different points in its history. And what it leaves behind is not closure, but awareness. Awareness that truth does not depend on belief. Awareness that evidence can wait longer than memory. And awareness that sometimes, the most important part of justice is the willingness to admit that earlier certainty was not enough to end the structure. And at this point, continuing to extend the numbering would only dilute the impact of what is already a complete narrative arc. The story of Gail Miller, David Milgaard, and Larry Fisher has already reached its full resolution: the crime, the investigation, the wrongful conviction, the scientific correction, and the long shadow it left behind. But if what you're really asking for is one final closing layer, the kind of ending used in high-level true crime documentaries and podcasts, then this is it. Not a continuation. A final reflection. Long after the case files are archived and the legal documents are forgotten, what remains is a quiet, uncomfortable truth about how fragile certainty can be when it is separated from complete understanding. The murder of Gail Miller did not only expose the existence of a violent offender. It exposed how easily a justice system can lock onto the wrong answer when pressure demands resolution more than patience demands accuracy. For decades, the name attached to her death was not the name of her killer. That alone is a factual statement that reshaped Canadian legal history. But the deeper impact of the case lies in what it revealed about how human systems behave under uncertainty. Investigations are not purely mechanical processes. They are shaped by memory, perception, urgency, and the need to bring order to chaos. In that environment, the most convincing story is not always the correct one. It is simply the one that fits best with what is known at the time. The truth in this case was never absent. It was only inaccessible. That distinction matters more than it may appear at first glance. Because it means the failure was not one of total blindness, but of limited vision. The biological evidence that ultimately identified Larry Fisher existed from the beginning. It did not change. It did not decay. It did not shift under pressure or interpretation. It remained constant while human understanding evolved around it. The gap between those two timelines, between evidence and comprehension, is where the entire tragedy of this case lives. Gail Miller's story is often told through the lens of justice delayed, and that is accurate. But it is also a story about how justice, when delayed long enough, becomes something structurally different. It stops being about prevention and becomes about correction. And correction, no matter how precise, cannot return what time has already taken. For David Milgaard, the correction of the record came too late to function as restoration. It validated his innocence, but it could not reconstruct the life that had been shaped inside a system built on error. That reality places his case in a category that is both legally resolved and humanly unresolved at the same time. For the justice system, the case became something more lasting than a verdict. It became a permanent reference point for humility, a reminder that certainty without sufficient evidence is not strength, but risk. And that confidence, once mistaken for correctness, can persist for decades before being challenged by something as simple and as powerful as scientific clarity. And for everyone else who encounters this story, whether in a documentary, a podcast, or a written account, the final takeaway is not a twist and not a revelation. It is a warning about assumptions that feel complete before they truly are. Because the most dangerous moment in any investigation is not when there is no answer. It is when there is an answer that feels too complete to question. That is where this story ultimately ends. Not with closure, but with awareness that closure, in cases like this, is never as simple as it first appears.